Good morning, everyone. Thank you. I thought I would begin today by performing a very useful public service. I would like to offer you all a last-minute gift suggestion for a friend or family member over this festive period. And I'd like to recommend a book. I'd like to recommend St. John McGill's Last Journey by Freeman Wills Crofts. Now, you may never have heard of this august work, and I confess that this gift suggestion will only work if the person you have in mind enjoys vintage British detective fiction. Crofts wrote his books in the same period as Agatha Christie, and he was extremely successful in his day. However, only true lovers of the genre know his name now. The books he wrote, and this was back in the 1930s or 40s, were very much of his time. And you need a very special amount of interest in railways and ferry timetables to keep up with the plots. I hope you're getting a feel for what this gift might be like. But you never know, it might suit that particular person. Now, you might ask yourself, why am I mentioning detective fiction to you a bare week before Christmas? Well, that's because the overall title of this Advent sermon series is Unexpected Visitors. And given today's reading from Luke, you might have been expecting something about the infamous innkeeper who turns away the visitors, Joseph and Mary, just as she is about to give birth. But I am offering you instead the mysterious case of the disappearing innkeeper. Some of you might remember Simon Tyndall's sermon about this a few years ago. And so you know that there is now some debate about whether Mary and Joseph ever turned up at an inn in the first place. Reflection on the Greek used in verse 7 of our passage, particularly the word translated guest room, and knowledge of the prevailing culture of the time leads some scholars now to wonder whether, in fact, Mary and Joseph turned up at a family member's residence, the kind of house where the animals were kept in part of the same building as the humans. There was no separate guest room for them, as our Bible reading today clearly says. And it follows that Mary might have laid Jesus in a manger, in an area of the property normally reserved for livestock. Perhaps the animal quarters were to the side of the main living area, or they occupied part of the ground floor, with the family living above them. Now, none of this, of course, negates the Bible stories we've ever read, or all the nativity plays we've ever seen, or will see in the future, which feature the potentially villainous character about whom the Bible is actually silent. Those tellings of the story highlight the precarious nature of Jesus' birth and can still be very useful illustrations. But they're not the main focus of today's talk. Now, of course, I am not pretending to pronounce definitively on Jesus' birth. There are still too many competing theories to do this. But for today, I'm taking the animal quarters of a family member's home as the setting for the birth. And I'm imagining Mary, Joseph, and Jesus as the unexpected visitors in that home. So what was it actually like for the householders? What did they know about the situation when they heard that knock on the door? They were presumably expecting some family members to arrive, given that there was a census taking place. But the burning question was, had they tidied up? Were there still socks tucked away in the corners of the sofas? And had they hoovered behind the TV? I look back in awe at a childhood memory through adult eyes now. So my stepmother spent many years in Canada and Uganda before she came back to England and met and married my father. One evening, our newly constituted family was sitting down to dinner when the doorbell went. And on the doorstep were an unknown couple whom none of us had ever met before. It turned out that these were Canadian friends of friends touring around England. They had been given our address and they simply turned up out of the blue, expecting accommodation. Seemingly effortlessly at the time, my mother made up a spare bed and proceeded to offer them wonderful hospitality for 3 or 4 days while they toured around the local area. Now, I can only step back in amazement now at her handling of something I would find very tricky to deal with, if I'm honest. But back to the householders in our passage. When their unexpected visitors arrived, what did they actually know about the new arrivals? Did they know anything about Joseph's situation or the real circumstances of Mary's pregnancy? Had they bought into a story of shame and disgrace? And was Mary warmly welcomed, or was she barely tolerated on Joseph's account? And what kind of Mary did they think that they were getting? What did they see when they looked at her? Did they see a young, worn-out pregnant mother who perhaps didn't deserve Joseph's unexplained loyalty? Or could they see the other Mary, the humble, feisty one, who had the courage to say yes to God and to speak out the words that we know as the Magnificat in Luke chapter 1, to proclaim the topsy-turvy nature of the kingdom of God and its radical justice? The one who talked about proud people being cast down, and rich people being hungry, and the humble and hungry being raised up. If the householders knew that side of her, did that make them more welcoming? Or did they open the door very slowly and with a great deal of unease? If Mary was going to talk like that during her pregnancy, what on earth was she going to bring into their home? Whatever their level of knowledge, or any mixed feelings on their part, this seems to be a story of hospitality. I choose to imagine the householders doing the best they could with the little they had. You, of course, might interpret the story very differently. There was not, however, unlimited space available, and there was no separate guest room, as we've just read. And so Mary gave birth, and she laid the Son of God in an animal trough. The Messiah came into the world through the body of a woman, with all the danger and indecency that that comprises. And he was placed in a manger where animals fed. Now there's definitely something significant about that manger. It is mentioned 3 times in the first 16 verses of chapter 2. So Luke must be making a point of some kind. And here I'm concentrating on just the first of these. In verse 7, we're told that Mary gave birth to her firstborn, a son, and placed him in a manger. And in my imagination, I see Mary speaking to Luke about the fact that this is where she had to lay this significant child. Someone she knew was very much out of the ordinary. The circumstances of the birth, including the manger, made a deep impression on her. Was she grateful for the manger? Outraged? Too relieved to have survived? Too exhausted to care? Was the manger or feeding trough clean and unused? Was it covered in golden hay as we see on the Christmas cards? Or was it something very different? Whatever it was, I get the impression that she definitely mentioned it. The point is, it's what the householders had to offer in the circumstances. The manger was deeply ordinary, even lowly. We don't know if it was in a good state, but it was to hand. It was there to welcome the unexpected visitor. And, even if unwittingly, the householders put it at God's disposal. And talking of unexpected unexpected visitors, the infant who occupied the manger was himself both expected and unexpected. If we listen to the words from the Old Testament prophet Micah this morning, there's obviously some reason for expectation. We read in Micah 5, verse 2, "But you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, though you are small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come for me one who will be ruler over Israel, whose origins are from of old, from ancient times." Of course, we don't know exactly what Micah's audience understood by this. If they were under military occupation at the time, perhaps they thought it might be a military ruler who would overthrow their oppressors, although it's a little strange to mention Bethlehem rather than Jerusalem. And we have no idea if they understood how long they would have to wait. Several hundred years, in fact, however you date this passage. But we look back now on this text with a particular understanding. Lo and behold, several hundred years later, as we know, an angel speaks to an amazing young woman and tells her something that I think would send most of us into shock. But somehow, this woman, Mary, the God-bearer, finds it within herself to say yes to all of this and to embark on a journey whose immediate outcome we are waiting to celebrate in about a week's time. And although it wasn't one of our readings today, the Gospel of Matthew confirms what the waiting is all about, in very similar words to the Micah passage. When Jesus is born, and when King Herod deviously inquires where the Messiah is likely to be, so that he can worship him, Matthew sums up the response of his advisors like this. This is Matthew 2, verse 6. "But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people, Israel." That's pretty close to Micah 5, verse 2, I would say. So the baby was expected, and had been so for centuries, but not then, and not in those circumstances. Perhaps in a palace worthy of a king, perhaps in a military barracks of some description. Jesus was actually born under Roman occupation, and perhaps he would be the new liberator of his people. Jesus was expected, but not in the way he turned up, in an animal feeding trough, in a home of slender means. He was expected and unexpected at the same time. But in choosing to put what they had at the disposal of their guests, however poor and unworthy, the householders facilitated the birth of the Son of God. It wasn't a good resting place for a baby, but it was a resting place. And in their offering of what they had, of what was there, they unwittingly welcomed Christ himself. And in doing this, they gave us an image which, though unfamiliar to many of us in our daily lives, explains to us something profound about the character of God. Now, it's easy to romanticize all this, given the rather pristine scenes we are offered on many Christmas cards. But when I think about the baby lying in the manger, I think about God lying down in the thick of it, lying down with us in the scratchy straw, dependent on the generosity of others, in a country under occupation. It might not be the absolute worst start in life, but it's not the best either. And I think about a God who experiences our humanity from the depths as well as the heights. I think about the Creator God who fully participates in that divine creation. 2,000 years later, and all grown up, we are still compelled by the idea of the manger. And how can we explain this? Partly, I think, because it's so strange that God would act like this, that the divine would become human for us. And partly, I think, because a baby is so tangible and can't in any sense be overlooked. We know that the baby will grow up, and we will have to deal with that. Lavinia Byrne describes our attraction to the feeding trough in the following way. She sees the manger as great evidence of God's overwhelming desire to be with us. And as we ourselves are drawn towards it, in her words, we are attracted to the very source of our being and the means of our redemption. Because the uncomfortable journey of Jesus, through whom all things are made, includes the manger and leads all the way to the cross. And we have a God who is prepared to go through all of that for us. And that is truly unexpected. I can't help drawing a parallel between the manger and our own hearts as we prepare for Christmas. For any of us, Christ might be the expected, yet unexpected visitor this year. And I say this to committed Christ followers and those who are not so sure alike. What I'm trying to express is this. At this time of the Christian year, as we're waiting to celebrate the fact that God entered our world as a human being, perhaps we think we understand Christmas. And perhaps we really do, because we've all been through Christmas many, many times before. But right now, in this turbulent period, when we're still navigating the COVID pandemic on top of and through the rest of daily life, are we ready to be sure and unsure all at once? To fully position ourselves, like the manger, if you will, to receive God? Just to be there, to offer all that there is? And can we be open again to the idea that Christ's presence in our lives might not manifest as we had planned, or as we had thought? That God truly might be and do the unexpected.